University College of Washington University, educational television station, present course for television. The Religions of Man, with Dr. Houston Smith, Associate Professor of Philosophy at Washington University.
Last week we talked about the life of Jesus, some of the things that he did, some of the things that he said, the impression that he made on those of his associates who were closest to him. Tonight we pick up the story from there. What happened immediately following his ministry is, of course, well known to everyone. After mingling with the people, teaching them for a number of months, we're not sure just how many, they took him and they killed him. He was executed, died. That might very well have been the end of the story. There have been any number of visionaries who have proposed schemes and who have been killed, and that's the last we hear about them. But in this case, it was just the beginning. The disciples, those who had known him best, became suddenly transformed. We hear of tongues of fire descending upon them, and people who weren't really good speakers at all, they hadn't been, suddenly became passionately eloquent. And they went around preaching what we now generally call the gospel, but which, if we were to translate it more literally, we would call the good news. Starting in a little room in Jerusalem, they fanned out and spread their message across the entire Mediterranean world, Greece, Rome, North Africa, Asia Minor, until even in the very generation in which Jesus lived, this new doctrine had taken root in all the major cities of the Mediterranean world. Now, what was this good news which snapped history in two in terms of BC and AD and left its tremendous impact upon the world in the Christian church? Was it the ethical teachings that we noted last time? The Sermon on the Mount, love thy neighbor as thyself, do unto others as you would that they should do unto you? Was it the ethical teachings of Jesus which constitute the good news? And the answer is that it wasn't. What then was it? What was this good news? Well, here it is in symbolic form. We think of the symbols of Christianity in somewhat different terms, the cross and so on. But during the early years, Christianity was a persecuted religion. These were the days of the catacombs, when it was an underground movement, and the cross would be too obvious a symbol. And so one of the ones which was most frequently used was this symbol of a fish. People who would be conversing with one another along the seashore would sketch the simple outlines of a fish in the sand. And if the other person was a Christian, he would recognize the symbol and respond in kind. Or on the catacomb walls, one would find chiseled this image, which would indicate the direction of where the Christians were meeting in worship. What did it mean? What is the symbol? And the answer is found in this fact, that the Greek letters which make up the word fish, each one of them stands for a key term in the Christian faith. Translated in terms of the words which the letters represent, we have in the word fish this message: Jesus Christ, Son of God, Savior. That's the good news. Jesus Christ, Son of God, Savior. But what does this mean? Well, some who go to church every Sunday have been brought up with this and know very well what this means. It's self-evident to them. But what we want to do this evening is try to go back behind this immense history of Christendom to find out what this meant to those early Christians. What was the good news? Literally, when it was news. Well, to see what it meant, we have to go back to those who preached it and to those who heard it. And when we do, when we go back to those who listened to those who were preaching it, we suddenly notice something very interesting. That often when they heard the good news, it was not only what they heard, but what they saw. Specifically, what they saw was lives which had been transformed. They saw men and women ordinary in every way except for the fact that they seemed to have found the secret of living. In them there was a kind of tranquility, simplicity, a cheerfulness which they didn't encounter anywhere else. These were people who seemed to have made a success of their living. Specifically, there seemed to be two characteristics which enlivened these early Christians. One was the quality of love which suffused their lives. One of the earliest commentaries we have on the Christians is an observation made by an outsider. See how these Christians love one another. Here were people who not only said that all men were equal in the sight of their Father, but who lived as though they meant it. But the other great quality, perhaps even more conspicuous in the lives of these early Christians, was the quality of joy. If any two things are clear, I suppose they're these: that the word which we use to characterize most people's religious experience would not be the word radiance. But the other fact is that as one reads the New Testament account, one discovers that this is precisely the word that has to be used to characterize the religious experience of these early Christians. Take Paul, for example. Here was a man who could outdo almost anyone in terms of the sufferings he had gone through. Just name anything in the way of sufferings, and Paul could go you one better. If you had been imprisoned for 6 weeks, he had been imprisoned for 6 months. If you had been beaten with 10 stripes, he had been beaten with 100 stripes. If your ship had been sunk, his ship had been sunk deeper. Any way you want to take it, he had had more of the suffering than most of the people he talked to. And yet, here was a life whose constant refrain was joy. In spite of all his sacrifices, wanderings, and unceasing work, this is the constant theme of his letters. Here are the phrases: joy unspeakable and full of glory, or thanks be to God who giveth us the victory, or we're more than conquerors, or God who commanded the light to shine out of darkness has shined in our hearts. In these early communities, Christian communities, they sang not out of convention, but simply out of the irrepressible overflow of joy in their lives. Here were people for whom life was no longer a problem to be solved, It was a glory to be discerned. Now, what caused this joy and love which characterized the lives of these early Christians? Well, I think the answer is that they found two intolerable burdens had been lifted off of their lives. What are these? Well, as we read their accounts, I think we can see two great fears which tend to pressure life with anxiety had been removed. First, the fear of death. We don't have to speak of this fear because it's so familiar to all of us. Carl Jung, the great psychologist, I believe it was, who said that he had yet to find a patient over 40 whose basic problem was not the fear of death. But there was a second fear from which these people had been released, and this was the fear of guilt. Guilt is a more difficult fear to discern, to see. Sometimes some people feel that we're a generation that doesn't feel guilty, but the psychologists don't share that view. Their view is that guilt weighs very heavily upon modern man. Everybody has his distinctions between good and bad. You can't live without having these distinctions. And out of this distinction, there arises in every life a concept of what that life ought to be, what it might be. And out of this comes a sense of one's destiny, the life which might be mine. And then along with that, paralleling it right by the side of it, is the realization of failure, the times in which we act against the norm, not merely the times in which we're cruel or indecent to other people, but in times in which we fail to live up to what might be our opportunity. Well, this is abstract, and yet it's very real, too. It's something we don't sense while the sun is out during the daylight hours, but after we go to bed, as we lay in bed, the sense of failure is likely to come to all of us. One gets it in expressions like Gerard Manley Hopkins, the poet, "I wake and feel the fell of night, not day." And then going on, "Self-yeast of the spirit, a dull dough sours." Or I just heard today, Keats, we think of him as a silver-tongued poet, and yet what epitaph did he have on his tombstone? It was these lines, "Here lies a life which was written in water." Well, in its acute form, this sense of failure, of guilt, can come to a sense of self-condemnation, which can be terribly repressive upon life. When we ask then, why the joy in the lives of these early Christians, I think we have to say it was because these two great fears had been taken from them, the fear of death and the fear of guilt and self-condemnation. Now, we've been asking, what does the good news mean for the early Christians? And we've tried to root this meaning back basically into their experience, because we must never forget that the creeds didn't come first and the experience thereafter. It was the experience of a new life, of a salvation, a changed and transformed and redeemed life, which came first, and the creeds came in after to try to explain what they had experienced. When they asked themselves what caused this change in the quality of their life, then they traced it universally back to their experience with Christ, because we're talking about the early Christians, the people who had known him, who had lived with him, and who had experienced his presence. During their time with them, we saw last week, they came to the conclusion that he was divine. And out of this, they came to an experience of God's love.
God's love was no longer for them an abstraction. Here it was, something which they had concretely realized. Here then was the ultimate power of the universe, God, who they had felt as concretely loving them. And moreover, this God not only had demonstrated his love for them by dying for them, and greater love hath no man than this, but beyond that, he had demonstrated his power by transcending death. This they were convinced of because of the resurrection experience. And however people today interpret the resurrection incident, Christ's rising from the tomb, this much is at least clear, that for the early Christians it was not a belief, it was an experience of some kind. Now, out of this I think we can see why the good news was not basically a matter of the ethical teachings of Jesus. It was a new view of man's setting in the world. The ultimate reality they had experienced as a reality which loved them, and out of this love forgave them for their failures, and they had also experienced the power of this love to transcend death. And therefore these two fears had been broken in their experience. Now we come in the end to the question of the creeds. The mind was not the first element to work in the Christian church. What we have tried to show, tried to suggest, is that for the early Christians, these concepts were rooted basically in their experience. And yet the mind soon began to enter. It must always. And here we have, during the first 3 and 4 centuries, the forging of the basic intellectual structure of classical Christianity. Let's touch on 3 of the basic ideas involved. The idea of the incarnation, of the atonement, and of the Trinity. The incarnation, as the word suggests, is the doctrine of God taking on human form. And this is what the disciples felt that they had actually experienced, God in their midst in human form. And the early church worked throughout these centuries to keep that idea clear. It was very difficult because it involved the tightrope walk of asserting that Christ was divine, fully divine, and at the same time he was fully human. And yet only this kind of a concept, they felt, did adequate justice to their experience of the ultimate reality and power having been in their midst and revealed himself to them as loving towards them. What difference does such a doctrine make? Well, it makes, this is what it meant for them, and this is what it means, I think, for those who come to understand it. It meant that the ultimate power is not indifferent, not aloof, and stands not in condemnation upon man, but takes the initiative towards man in such love that we realize that with all our shortcomings, we nevertheless are accepted by God. Now, as to the second concept, the concept of the atonement, this follows directly from that of the incarnation. The idea of the atonement, the literal meaning, is of course the at-one-ment, the reconciliation. This idea presupposes an estrangement. And this is, of course, in the religious concept, the idea of sin. In the modern world, our ideas of sin have degenerated to very trivial things. we think of the puritanical virtues and sins, drinking, card playing, gambling. But in theological terms, sin really means one thing and should be spoken of in the singular, basically. It means separation. God being perfect, his will being perfect, man is separated from that perfect will. He needs, therefore, to be rebound or returned or restored in God's sight. And the atonement is the theological way of evidencing this fact that God takes the initiative in restoring man to a place of acceptance in his sight. Let me take an illustration from the field of child psychology. If a child has to live simply in terms of trying to live up to the demands of what the parent would expect from a model child, the child will always fall short. He's bound to spill his milk or track mud into the house. And if then he has to justify himself in terms of his own behavior for the parent, he will never succeed in living up to the standard of what a child should be. But if the child feels instead that he doesn't have to necessarily make his own way in his parent's favor, but rather feels that he is in a context of being accepted by the parent despite the fact that he spills his milk or tracks in the mud. This sense of security that comes from being in a context where he is suffused with love, rather than having to make his way in the face of indifference and in terms of meeting certain ethical codes. This can perform a tremendous effect upon the child. In fact, the child psychologists say that given this attitude of love and acceptance on the part of the parent, then this will do more to produce a transformed behavior in the life of the child than ever so much in the way of rigid demands if they are not backed up by this love. To carry the analogy over into theological terms, what the atonement says to man in its religious meaning is that he stands in a world in which it is not up to him to make his way in terms of God's favor by living up to specific exalted demands, but rather that he is surrounded by a being, a power which accepts, which loves him despite all his failures. And the Christian experience has seemed to suggest that when there is this feeling of acceptance, then the goodness flows in a spontaneous way, which it doesn't when it is forced in terms of simply on one's own attempting to meet the ethical demands. I come in the close to the idea of the Trinity. This, of course, too, is one of the key ideas of the early church. And it comes out of the threefold experience of God. God as creator, as experienced in nature. God as Son, as experienced in the life and teachings of Jesus. And God as the Holy Spirit, as experienced in the divine movement within the individual heart and within the corporate community of the church. For the Christian, God is one, and yet he is also three, which gives an ultimacy to each one of these experiences. And yet, it is not three gods, nor is it simply one God in an absolutely simple sense. It is a triune God. Whether this is logical, well, someone wrote to me this week and asked me if I would have the courage to say that some of these ideas, the incarnation, fully God yet fully man, and the Trinity, were not logical. Well, you don't have to have courage to say that. The church has been saying this all the time. The question is whether logic is, in terms of our present mental equipment, is to be the final test of religious adequacy. And all I would like to say is that the church seems to be doing no more in the way of suggesting that this is not necessarily the final criterion than science is doing. Because if there were time, we could quote Oppenheimer, Niels Bohr in the principle of complementarity, in which they're proposing that when there is evidence to support two contradictory sides of a proposition, it is better to hold these in tension of contradiction, hoping that there will be a time coming later in which their conflict will be resolved. I wish there were time to continue. I always have a sense of inadequacy in terms of trying to articulate some of these basic themes of the Christian doctrine, but our time is up. Next week we shall go on to some later developments in Christianity and the church. Tonight, however, we've been talking about the church in its infancy, those early, fateful, and exciting years in which there was persecution, there were the catacombs, there were fish on the walls, there were tongues of fire. When the gospel was spread by a group of ex-fishermen and tent makers. I want to close with just a few sentences from a typical sermon from these early years. One of the first we have on record. Paul has been talking to a cross-section of the people. He's been telling them that God sent his Son to live among men, that they didn't recognize him. In the end, they killed him, but that God raised him up from the dead. And winding up his sermon, he says, and this is the good news which we have to tell you, that the promise made to our fathers has been fulfilled by God for us, their children, in the raising of Jesus to life. Beware then that what the prophets said does not apply to you. For the prophets wrote, look at this, you scornful souls, and lose yourselves in wonder. For in your days I do such a deed that if man were to tell you this story, you would not believe him.
The Religions of Man is produced by Washington University and KETC Channel 9, the St. Louis educational television station and production center.
This is National Educational Television.